Well, good evening, everyone. I'm so excited that you could join us tonight. I am, in case we haven't met yet, my name is Jeffrey McPherson. I'm a professor of theology here at Roberts Wesleyan, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Barnes Science and Faith Symposium. As we begin, I just have a couple of things to keep in mind. We have a packed house tonight, and that is so exciting to have a night on theology and science and have a packed house. This is great. I'm excited to see everyone here, and just to ask everyone to especially because we're so full, just to keep in mind all of the exits that we have. There's 4 different exits for the room. Nothing's going to happen, but just to keep that in mind, and just to let you know that there are restrooms outside the room. If you go to the hallway, sort of up the ramp, there are restrooms that you can find up the ramp if that's a need. Albert Einstein famously said one time that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. One of my favorite authors, Alfred North Whitehead, made this claim at one point. He said, "When we consider what religion is for humanity and what science is, it is no exaggeration to say that the future course of history depends upon the decision of this generation as to the relation between them." The Barnes Science and Faith Symposium was established in 2010 to explore these very issues of science and faith. And so the symposium was established to clearly present relevant scientific data relating to specific faith science issues, to articulate the Christian perspective of faith science issues, and to expose the community of Roberts Wesleyan and Northeastern to scholars who are well-recognized scientists and devout Christians to ask some of these really hard questions. The Barnes Symposium is made possible by the generous support of Dr. and Mrs. David Barnes, who have been active participants in the Roberts Wesleyan College community since the 1970s. Dr. Barnes, and the Barnes are sitting right over here. Dr. Barnes, yes. He is a professor emeritus in biology at Roberts. He taught at Roberts from 1970 to 2004, and his wife Avis taught in the Rochester taught school in the Rochester district for 30 years as well. And they established the Barnes Symposium to foster an annual lecture series that would address issues of science and Christian faith, and we're thankful that they have. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Thomas J. Oord. Thomas Oord is a theologian, he's a philosopher, and a scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He is an award-winning author, and he has written or edited more than 25 books. A 12-time faculty award-winning professor, Oord teaches at institutions around the globe. A gifted speaker, he is known for his contributions to research on love, open and relational theology, science and religion, and the implications of freedom and relationships for transformation. His 2 most recent books are The Uncontrolling Love of God and God Can't: How to Believe in God and Love After Tragedy, Abuse, and Other Evils. Previous books include Defining Love, The Nature of Love, and Relational Holiness. Now just a quick note on the books. We do have a small book table set up outside if you're interested in purchasing Dr. Oord's books. Tonight we only have The Uncontrolling Love of God, but we do have his more recent book, God Can't, that will actually be here tomorrow, just not tonight. And so, if you are interested in purchasing a copy of that book, 2 things I can suggest to you. Number 1, there will be a display of them in the bookstore starting tomorrow. But also, the bookstore manager, Darren Walton, has graciously offered that if you wish to purchase it tonight, he will ship it to you free of charge. So that option will be available to you, and Darren Walton, our bookstore manager, is just outside at a table selling copies of The Uncontrolling Love of God. Dr. Oord has lectured on every continent except for Antarctica. Is that in your future? Are you hoping for that? He has lectured at prestigious educational institutions like Harvard, Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge. He served 20 years as a university professor of theology and philosophy, and he has served 10 years in pastoral ministry. Dr. Oord is many things. He's a husband, he's a father and a grandfather, he's an ordained elder in the Church of the Nazarene. He's an award-winning photographer. If you follow him on Twitter, you will see he's also an avid hiker, and a few years ago hiked 1,000 miles over one summer in Idaho. That's an accomplishment. So if you follow him on Twitter, you'll see he has some amazing photography, and the landscape in Idaho is it's breathtaking. And he, perhaps one of the most interesting things, was formerly a guitarist in a punk metal band. He's done a bit of everything. He's done a bit of everything. Tonight, Dr. Oord will be speaking on 10 reasons the science and religion dialogue matters. In addition, time permitting, Dr. Oord will be glad to respond to questions and engage dialogue after the lecture. I just have to say that I appreciate Tom. I've known him for a while, and I appreciate a few things about Tom in particular. I really appreciate his willingness to tackle tough issues. Not everybody is willing to put themselves out there. And something that I really have come to appreciate about Tom is that he's willing to stake out claims on really hard issues and to make his arguments and to seek for consistency and truth as best as he knows it. And I admire that deeply. And I also appreciate Tom for his really clear thinking. If you do get a chance to read his books, you'll see that he presents his ideas both clearly and winsomely, and I really appreciate that about your writing and about your presenting as well, and I'm glad to consider him a friend. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Oord for this evening's lecture.
Thanks so much. Kevin came in at recess as a sixth grader into the classroom, and he had a major dent in the side of his head. He was playing baseball, line drive shot up the middle. He's playing shortstop. He dives for the ball. The second baseman had come over at the same time. They hit heads, and there was literally a dent in Kevin's head. He looked around and saw everything was double. Now, Kevin's teacher knew this was not a good situation. He started to throw up. We got some major problems here, but she also knew that Kevin came from a very devout Christian background. His parents were hardcore when it comes to Jesus, and she worried that they might have views about medicine that meant that they did not want their Kevin going to the doctor. So she decided, she thought about what she ought to do. Does she go with her gut, which says, get this kid to the doctor? Or does she follow through on the religious preference of his father and mother? She decides to call Kevin's father in hopes that he'll say, go to the hospital. She calls him up. She tells him Kevin's situation, and he says, yes, take him to the hospital. She's relieved. He goes, ends up having to have surgery. He's in the hospital for a couple of weeks. Comes back to class, doesn't seem to have any major long-term problems. And she's thinking about this scenario that she was in and, this dilemma she was facing. She wasn't sure what she ought to do. And was so obviously relieved that Kevin's father said thumbs up on the doctor. And after about 2 or 3 months, she happened to see Kevin's dad waiting for him after school and decided she would take a kind of a leap of faith, or at least a bold move, and ask him a little about theology and science. So she came up to Kevin's father and said, boy, it's so great to have Kevin back in class. He's doing well. You've got a bright son, all those things the teachers say. And then she said, I'm just curious. I know you're a Christian. I know you believe in a healing God. And I know that you used a doctor. Tell me, do you think that God healed your son or the doctor healed your son? Kevin's father said something that I think is pretty interesting. He said this: I don't think the doctor could have successfully operated and healed my son if God wasn't providing that strength and knowledge to do that. The doctor needed God in order for that healing to happen. But it's what he said next that was really interesting. He said, I don't think God probably could have healed Kevin if it hadn't been for the doctor. Wild claim. Not just that the doctor needs God. I'm guessing most people in this room who believe in God say thumbs up on that. God is the source of all healing, etc., etc. But this was a claim that God needed the doctor or a doctor in order for Kevin to get better. It's this kind of question that arises in our day-to-day life in which science and theology attempts to provide plausible answers. And I'm so glad you're here tonight to wrestle with some of these things. I'm going to look at 10 reasons why you ought to take this dialogue seriously. Before I jump into that, though, let me thank Dave and Avis for funding the Barnes Symposium, and Dave Basinger for being behind making this happen, and Jeff McPherson and Chris O'Brien, who's I don't know if he's here, but he put things together for me to speak yesterday at Pierce. And Evangeline, he's back there. He's hiding. I see you, brother. I see that hand. Pray for you. Evangeline, thanks for your help. I've had a great time here the last few days. You guys are a great community, and I've had great hosts and hostesses. We started this evening by looking a little bit at Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein's got to be the most famous scientist of the 20th century. I mean, even people who don't know much about science know his name. They know his hair, which, that's one way to get famous, I guess. Make sure your hair is wild and unruly. They also, if a person knows something about science and they know an equation, they probably know E equals mc squared. But I've got some interesting news for many of you tonight. Albert Einstein sucked as a theologian. Most of you in this room are better theologians than Albert Einstein was. So if tonight when you go home and you see your children, your spouse, significant other, you can say, I'm smarter than Einstein in at least one area of life, and that's religion and theology. He struggled to try to make sense of the universe and spent the lion's share of his time studying physics. He's famous for the theory of special and general relativity and other kinds of things. And he didn't have a very deep or clear notion about what God is like and about what religion is like. He really hated the idea that there's a personal God. He sometimes called himself an agnostic, other times called himself a pantheist. A pantheist means that's a person who thinks that everything that exists is God. But he never was very clear. And even this line that Jeff quoted earlier, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind, is like, I'm not quite sure what to do with that. About the only thing I know that this is saying is that we need both. And I'm totally on board with that. But what does it mean to be blind or lame? I've got some theories, but that's not where I want to go tonight. What I want to go tonight is to say, the intuition that Einstein had, that we need both of them if we're going to not only make sense of the world, but also, I believe, have a coherent and plausible view of God, that we need both of these things is something I wholeheartedly affirm. And I hope by the time you leave tonight, you'll leave thinking, you know what, I got to take this science and religion dialogue a lot more seriously, because there's a lot of things that are going to prompt me to think more deeply and more widely about my life, the world I live in, and the God I believe in. So first of all, let's start with a real easy question. And that is, does the universe seem to be created by something or someone? You know, the classic question in philosophy, why is there something rather than nothing? Real easy. Well, if you're a person who believes in God, like I do, I think the world was created, the universe was created. But it's not exactly crystal clear to everybody. Even though the Apostle Paul famously says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that they are without excuse, yada, yada, yada. Some people think it's just so obvious the world was created by God. And other people are like, boy, it's not obvious to me. It's not like atheists are stupid. They look at the same world and come to a different conclusion. And what I think is really interesting about this particular quote is at the first part of it, he says these things are invisible, and the end of it, he says they're clearly seen. That's someone who's looking through the eyes of faith. I come to you tonight as someone who looks at the world through the eyes of faith. But, and this is super important, it's not blind faith. I do not advocate you believe in God blindly. I do not advocate you think there is a God despite all the evidence and arguments to the contrary. I think there are good, strong arguments and good, strong evidence that there is a God. But at the end of the day, I don't think I can prove there is a God. I think God's invisible qualities, eternal power, and divine nature are revealed in creation. But when I look at my atheist and agnostic brothers and sisters, I don't think they're idiots for not seeing the same thing. The science and religion dialogue can help us to articulate our deep intuitions that there is a God, and that God is the creator of this universe. We can look at the design, the beauty, the amazing things, and also be realistic about the ugliness, the chaos, and the lack of design, and come to believe plausibly that there is a creator. So number one reason why you ought to take the science and religion dialogue seriously is that I think science investigates a universe that, at least apparently, from my perspective, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, apparently was created by God. Number two, I think that religion and theology, or science and theology, are like two sides of a binocular. That if you have both of them working, you can see a lot farther and a lot deeper than if you just have one. That science in and of itself can tell us truths about the world, and theology in and of itself can tell us truths about God and how we ought to live. But combined, we get a clearer view, we get a bigger picture, we look deeper and wider. I think about this a lot when I'm hiking. As Jeff mentioned, I'm a big-time backpacker. I love photography. I love to get out and go on long stretches. I can tell lots of backpacking stories. But when I look at the world and the diversity in it, and when I'm making photographs, trying to capture some of that beauty and diversity, I think to myself, having a view that there is a God who is a creator enhances my experience. It doesn't diminish it. And having the view that science tells us something true about the natural world, including this pair of young owls I took a picture of in southeast Idaho a few years ago, this helps me understand reality better. In 5 years ago, I guess it was, I decided I wanted to hike from Nevada to Canada through Idaho. Now, I'm guessing that most of you in this room are probably geographically challenged. You probably don't even know where Idaho is in the United States. But it happens to be up in the northwest corner. And if you combine Washington State and Oregon, Idaho is as long as both of those combined. Almost 1,000 miles top to bottom. And I decided I was going to do this solo. But I would occasionally bring one of my daughters with me. I have 3 daughters. And we got into a stretch where my middle daughter was with me, and we were going along, and we crossed a creek, and we saw a little cub. You can see the ears over here. And I thought to myself, uh-oh, you see a cub, there might be a mama bear. So I did what any loving father would do. I put my daughter between me and the bear, and we walked. No. I made lots of noise, had my camera ready. She just stood up to see where we were, and I made that particular shot. But there's lots of beauty in the world. This is my favorite waterfall in the state of Idaho. Lots of amazing things that I can appreciate not only scientifically, but also as someone who believes there is a God who is behind the beauty I see in my world. So, The second reason I think you ought to take the science and theology discussion seriously is that these suggest that life and ideas are, whoops, I missed it. I went too far. Got to go back to my first one to repeat my point here. There we go. That we can help us appreciate the world better when we have both science and theology. Now let me get to number 3. Science and theology suggest that life and ideas are interrelated, and we should work toward what I like to call an ecological civilization. This is the portion of the evening in which I talk about climate change. This is the portion of the evening in which I say, let's take science seriously when it says that we are doing things that are hurting our planet. Because I believe God not only cares for humans, but cares for all creation. And I think if we act for the good of all creation, we'll actually benefit ourselves. We're saving ourselves in many ways when we help save other species and life on our planet. We live in a world in which we're not isolated individuals, disconnected from everything else. We're individuals that are affected by our environments. And the way we treat our environment has a reciprocal effect on how it treats us. And not only that, it's the people who are the poorest, the weakest, the most vulnerable in the world who are going to be affected most negatively by the effects of climate change. I think we ought to work toward a way of looking toward the world that I'm calling an ecological civilization that says that not only does God care about you and me, but God cares about the whole kit and caboodle. And on that issue, that we're interrelated and that climate change is real and we need to do something about it, science is firmly on my side. I think Christians can use this to not only think about how we act, but think about the God who is present throughout all creation and loves it all. Number 4, let's talk about the Bible. I, like probably most of you, prize the Bible highly for what it teaches us about who God is and how God acts in the world. And I think this science and theology dialogue can actually help us, not hurt us, actually help us try to make sense of the Bible. Now, I know some of you are quickly going to, you got to be kidding me. The Bible is the problem here. Others of you are saying, well, the Bible is definitely right. If the scientists would just get on board, we'd get it figured out. I think that if we look at the world and look seriously at the Bible and what the Bible is about, what its intent and purpose is, then this can help us as we move through life. It was Galileo, or at least this is attributed to Galileo, probably predated him, but it was Galileo who said, the Bible teaches us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. He's basically saying the Bible is our source for understanding salvation. It doesn't necessarily tell us the truth about science. Now, I know some of you are here tonight who probably bristle at that. You want a Bible who tells us the truth about everything, or at least it can't be false in terms of science. I want to suggest to you that it's okay to think that the Bible gives us eternal truths about who God is and about the salvation God offers without thinking that the Bible tells us absolutely every truth about science or that it always aligns with current science. Now, when I first heard this particular quote, as a Wesleyan theologian who thinks that salvation just isn't about the afterlife, it's also about this life. I believe in the afterlife, but I think, as John Wesley would say, salvation begins now. And also, since I knew that the questions today are less about astronomy and more about biology, I decided I'm going to come up with my own phrase. So this is a Tom Oord original. The Bible tells us how to find abundant life, not the science of how life became abundant. It's the same general intent. It's saying we can trust Scripture when it tells us how we ought to live and how we can find salvation. But we don't necessarily have to think the Bible tells us everything we need to know about science. Number 5, science and theology informs us about what it means to be human, who we are and how we ought to act. I think science can help us. I don't think science gives us the whole truth, but I think theology must listen carefully to what science says about what our limitations are, what our capacities are, how we think about our color, our race, our gender, our sexuality, all those super hot topics that we're arguing about in our society today. Again, I don't think science is going to give us all the answers, but I think we as Christians need to listen carefully to science as we navigate through these really difficult and really complex questions about what it means to be human. Number 6. I think the science and theology dialogue can help us to care for creation. Now, this is a little different from this ecological civilization that I mentioned earlier, but they're closely related. As I hike in Idaho, I am time and time again brought face to face with other creatures who I think to myself, these tell me something about the way the world works and maybe even who God is as our creator. When I see deer and a fawn or these birds, I love doing animal and bird photography when I'm hiking, except that when you do that, you have to carry a zoom, and those things are so heavy. But anyway, I won't go into backpacking problems at the moment. Little chicks. This guy, I like badgers, but they can be really angry, and they can growl, and they make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And if they see you coming, they turn and they run to their hole to get inside. And I've been around them enough to know that they do this. So when I see them, I sprint as hard as I can past them, knowing that they're going to their hole, and then stop. And this guy was angry that he couldn't get in his hole, and it's like hissing at me. Lots of good stuff. This is 2 bull snakes having sex. My religion colleagues at my university say this is my animal pornography here. Very interesting. I won't go into details there. I grew up on a farm in eastern Washington State. And on the farm, we thought coyotes and foxes were the enemy. On the farm, we would occasionally take our .22s, get in our pickup truck, drive out into the sagebrush, and try to shoot the coyotes and foxes. As I got older, I decided I wanted to have a more positive, more life-affirming approach to reality and not just kill animals for the fun of it. And in order to do that, I decided what I would do is whenever I saw an animal, a bird, even an insect, I would say, "Hello, friend." And so I'd be walking along the trail and I'd see a little squirrel and I'd say, "Hello, friend." Or a sparrow. I decided I would do this over and over because I'm into Aristotelian virtue ethics, which is another topic. I would do it over and over, and it would begin to mold me in how I saw reality. One evening, I was next to the Snake River waiting for it to get dark enough so that I could photograph the stars. I had my favorite petroglyphs on some rocks there. I was going to light a fire, think that the light from the fire would go off the petroglyphs, then I'd have the Milky Way. I thought this is going to be an awesome shot. So I'm sitting there just kind of waiting for it to get dark enough for this to work, to light the fire, and I hear a little noise. And I look behind me, and there is a young coyote as close to me as to that, whatever that's called, podium. He'd walked up curious of what I was doing with this camera there. And the very first thing that came out of my mouth, without even thinking of it, was, "Well, hello, friend." And he sat down on his back haunches and took his back leg and scratched his ear like this, like my dog does at home. And so I took my camera and tried to get a picture, and then he just walked off into the darkness. I think if we begin to habituate ourselves in a different way toward creatures, maybe you're not like me, you didn't grow up killing lots of animals, but if you are like me, if you habituate yourselves differently to creation, we can fulfill the calling I think God gives to us to care for all creatures in God's world. Number 7. The 7th reason why I think we ought to engage the science and theology dialogue seriously is so that we can acknowledge what I like to call the real ministry of scientists. I remember I was an associate pastor in Walla Walla, Washington, and there was a biology teacher in our congregation who believed in evolution, and our pastor was not happy about this. And he considered scientists as really suspicious folks. And that was the kind of the atmosphere in the congregation. You know, scientists, you really can't trust them. I think scientists provide a real ministry to us. And people who, people like the ones I've pictured up here are working scientists. I don't know that everyone in this picture is a Christian, but these people who really want to do what God has called them to do and really have an important role in our world and in our Christian communities. Fortunately, Roberts Wesleyan is a place that I think believes that scientists have a real ministry. But I think that's important to emphasize. Number 8, I think engaging this dialogue often involves working toward conflict resolution. Here, I want to talk about the E word, evolution. This is the way some of my young earth creationists think about the evolution discussion. This is a comic, well, I guess it is a comic, but it's not funny in my mind. This is how they think, what is at stake when we think about Christianity, evolution, and faith. On this side, we have evolution, and notice that it's the same as Satan. And the evolutionists are firing away at a theory of creation in which Christ is at stake. And these evolutionists, they're smart. They're blowing up the foundation, the view of creation in Christ. Because they know if they blow up this, the whole thing goes down. And the outgrowth of evolution in the mind of this particular artist is all these things at the top that are bad in his mind. Now look at what's happening over here on the creation side of things. This one pastor up here, he's blowing up the bad things up here and not even aiming at the root. In their view, evolution is the root of all that's evil. This guy up here is aiming off into Never Never Land, and this guy here is fighting against other priests there. Christianity is really doomed in this. But the main point here is this. If you believe that evolution is what's wrong in the world, then you understand why you think that evolution is bombing the foundation of the Christian faith. This is not my view, but this is the view of some, and I think they are people of integrity. I just disagree with them on how this works. Excuse me. A few years ago, Pew Research did a poll on evolution and how people in the United States think about this. And you see the categories there. The question or the statement is, humans and other living things have either, 1, evolved over time due to natural processes, evolved over time guided by a supreme being, evolved over time, but I don't really know how, existed in their present form since the beginning of time. That's usually what we call the young earth perspective. And then the last one, I really don't know. Look what scientists say here. Only 2% of scientists polled think that humans and other living things have existed in their present form since the beginning of time. How drastically different that is from the general public. The theory of evolution, although there are different understandings of it within the scientific community and whether or not God is behind it or not, the theory of evolution is strongly held by the vast majority of scientists. But in the general public, that's not the case. Let me dive even deeper. This is if we look at Protestants and the general public and Catholics. Same exact things in terms of the Pew poll. Here's the general public at the top. Look at where evangelical Protestants are here. More than half of evangelical Protestants polled think that humans have existed in their present form since the beginning of time. Catholics are pretty close to the general public here, and you see some of the other options. It's this group of people who are oftentimes the most strongly against any view of evolution. I suspect some people here tonight are in that camp. I want to say to you, you're welcome as my brother and sister. I think of you positively. I think you're smart, but I disagree on this particular issue with you. Let me talk a little bit about where I see these camps kind of lining up. This one particular way of looking things says that the Bible is inherently opposed to evolution. So probably the most famous person in the world supporting this view is Ken Ham, and his organization is called Answers in Genesis. But there are other groups like this is Henry Morris III at the Institute for Creation Research. This is Al Mohler, who used to be the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. All of these folks not only think you can't find evolution in the Bible, which I think they're right about that, they think the Bible is inherently opposed to the theory of evolution. And so they think that we need to get rid of it entirely. There's another group of people who think that evolution is the enemy of Christianity. And probably the most famous atheist on the planet today is Richard Dawkins. This guy is in Oxford, and he's written lots of famous and popular books. But he's part of what are sometimes called the Four Horsemen, Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and they call themselves the Brights. They think that you can't believe in evolution and believe in Christianity, that they're in fundamental opposition, and so they're either atheists or agnostics. There's a middle position that interprets Christian faith as compatible with evolution, and that's where I'm at. Fortunately, I'm not the only one there. Let me give you a few other representatives. This is Deb Harzma. She's the president of a really great group called Dialoogue that tries to introduce, especially to evangelical Christians, how you can believe in evolution and be a Christian. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institute for Health, NIH, I think that's right. He's also in this camp, and then you're never too far out of bounds, you're never too far out in left field if you got the Pope on your side. Good old Francis. And the Roman Catholic tradition, generally speaking, has thought that you can believe in evolution, believe God creates through evolution, and have this middle position between either thinking the Bible has no place, is not compatible with it, or you just can't believe in God at all. As someone in the middle position, I recommend you consider that as a possibility. All right, number 9. Science and theology prompts us to ask the biggest questions of life. I don't have a lot of time for questions that don't matter. I want to ask the biggest, most important questions of my life and the entire planet. And that's what's so cool about science and religion. People in that discussion, they're asking the big questions, the things that matter now, not only for us personally, but for all of existence, trying to understand life. I like the way the musician artist Matt Carney puts it. The world's too big to never ask why, but the answers don't fall straight out of the sky. And for the sake of Jeff, who quoted Whitehead earlier, I put a Whitehead quote in this one. You can't shelter theology from science, or science from theology, nor can you shelter either of them from metaphysics, or metaphysics from either of them. There's simply no shortcut to the truth. This really jacks me up when I think about this, because I don't want to live my life twiddling my thumbs, worried about things that don't matter. I want to give my life to the biggest, boldest, baddest questions there are. And that's where the science and religion dialogue is happening. If you care about what matters most, think about engaging the science and theology dialogue. All right, number 10. Science and theology discussions can help us ponder if or in what ways our own lives really matter. I talk to a lot of people who aren't sure their lives matter. They think about the humongous universe we live in. They think about big problems, big questions, big population. They even talk about a big God. And they say to themselves, does what I do really matter? Is my life significant? Is it ultimately important? I think every single person's life makes a difference. The whole weight of the world isn't on your shoulders, but what you do matters now and for eternity. And I think the science and religion dialogue prompts us in those kinds of ways. In fact, I read the very first book of the Bible, the very first chapter of the Bible, as suggesting that we have a role to play in co-creating with God. Most of you probably know this passage. This is Genesis 1, where it talks about God creating things and then calling upon creation to respond, to be fruitful and multiply. And the passage ends by saying, God saw that it was good, and then he said, let's make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And so God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them, and God said, be fruitful and multiply. Now, most of the time we think of be fruitful and multiply as let's have sex. And I got no problem with sex. Let me just say that right up front. Sex, thumbs up for me. I think we ought to talk about sex more often in Christianity. But I think be fruitful and multiply is not just about sex. I think be fruitful and multiply transcends just reproduction. That we have an impact in the world in lots of ways that go beyond reproduction. As we influence one another with our ideas, our habits, our ways of being, that being fruitful and multiplying says that what we do really impacts others and I think impacts God. And that's one of the reasons why I think we ought to take the science and religion dialogue super seriously. So, my favorite time often in talking about these big issues is not the presentation, because I kind of know what I want to say before I get here. My favorite time is hearing from you, your questions, because I don't know what you're going to ask, and I don't know how I'm going to answer. So let's take some time. I think, Jeff, we've got a microphone to go around here, and I'm open to questions, as Jeff said, from tonight's presentation, from earlier today. Let me say at the beginning, I don't have all the answers. I'm often not even certain of what I have to say, but I'm going to propose ways of thinking that make sense to me, and I want you to consider them. We'll let Jeff decide who gets the mic.
Here, I'll see if I can run down here. Can you pass that down?
Thanks. That was great.
Thank you.
Your reason number 3, I think, is a great mission
Reason
opportunity.
3 was ecological civilization,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
For years, I've taught our confirmation class, and I always ask them every year, big problems, big fears in your life. What worries you the most, either personally or your life? And people my age around here, it was nuclear war. Right? I mean, we all did the duck and cover thing.
Yeah.
Never once came up, which was kind of impressive. But the number one fear was ecological catastrophe.
Yes.
And I think my generation is guilty of burying their head in the sands on this. It's a very deep concern, appropriately. I think there's too much pessimism behind it. There's reason that we can be a little more optimistic about that. But my point is, it is a great meeting place for millennials. It's a topic that you can discuss and bring in your faith through the science and show how we are called to take care of creation, and we're called to take good care of it. And I think that common ground is a great apologetic opportunity.
Thanks. There's so many things I could say in this topic. I'm going to resist the urge to go on forever and narrow it down to one kind of narrow slice, and that's economics. Think about the decisions you as a student made when you decided to come here or go somewhere else. Think about the rest of you, the kind of decisions you made in your jobs. It's so accepted in our society to put salary as number one. It's so accepted in our society to think that GDP is really the ultimate criteria of whether or not our society is doing well, if we're wealthier, if we're growing in GDP. But GDP doesn't equal happiness. You can have lots of money and your life sucks. Right? We have to have a different way of thinking about what matters most. Money matters, but not the most. Economics matter, but not the most. In an ecological civilization, we take that into account alongside a lot of other factors that promote well-being or undermine well-being. So thanks so much for bringing that up.
So what would you say is the importance and relevance of education and interfaith dialogue for helping Christians understand the importance of things like science and evolution? My understanding and my experience with young earth creationists and people on both sides who oppose it is they seem to lack a certain amount of education.
Yeah. I think education is really important. It's not the cure-all, but it's a really important thing. Let me talk about interfaith from the perspective of a Christian in the Wesleyan theological tradition. Those of you who may never heard of this word Wesleyan, that's a way of talking about a guy named John Wesley who lived a couple hundred years ago and whose ideas about theology have shaped the way this institution thinks about God and what it means to be a Christian. John Wesley had this idea that he called preventing grace that we now call prevenient grace. And prevenient grace is the idea that God is present throughout the world, acting first, calling, empowering, and inviting our response. And if we respond appropriately to God's call, then we experience salvation. We experience the abundant life that Jesus said He wanted to give. If you have this view, you can look at our Muslim brothers and sisters, our Buddhist brothers and sisters, and say, you know what? God is present there. We may not agree. We may not think they've got as much truth or a clearer understanding of what reality is than we do in Christianity, but we don't have to think that they're morons. We don't have to think that they've got nothing to offer. We can look at other faiths and say, yes, we accept who you are. We see valuable and truthful things there, but we find our Christian faith preferable for these kinds of reasons. So it's not an exclusive us only, you're all stupid and you ain't got nothing. It's we can be in conversation, learn from each other, but at the end of the day, we don't have to say every religion is the same. We can say, yeah, there's things about our faith that we think make more sense, and that's why we've chosen to be Christians.
So you teased us with this idea of how we impact God.
Yes.
Can you please expand on that more?
Yeah. I am a person who thinks that God is relational. That I think it's really biblical, actually. So I don't think I'm like bringing in a new idea. It's just that a lot of theologians in Christian history have begun with the idea that God is perfect. And then they've said, well, okay, if God's perfect, well, any change in a perfect being could only be toward imperfection. Therefore, God must never change in any respects. And if God is related to us, that means God has an impact, or we impact God. Well, that means change. Well, God must not be relational either. And so they've had a God who is what the classical theologians called impassible, non-relational, a God who's not affected by anything that we do. It just doesn't fit the Bible as I read it. The Bible that I read is God is sometimes pleased by what we do, sometimes angry, sometimes sad and disappointed. But what we do really has an impact on God. I think that's true not only for humans, I think all of creation has an impact on God. This has revolutionized my worship experience. I used to be in church, and we'd sing our choruses and our hymns, and they'd talk about God being mighty and loving and glorious. And I'd think to myself, well, you know, all we're really doing here is just reminding ourselves of God's attributes. And that's, you know, good, but, you know, it's just kind of like an educational experience. And then I started thinking, hold on a second. If God is everywhere, and what I do has an effect on God, then my praise of God in worship can actually please God. The God of the entire universe gets jacked up because I am worshiping. Man, that like motivates me to worship. I still think we need to talk about divine attributes and educate each other, but this view of God motivates me in my worship like I was not motivated previously. Yeah. I should tell jokes between questions here.
So you would be a theistic evolutionist, correct?
That's one way to put it, yeah.
All right. Well, how would you then say about the age of the Earth? There's the old Earth, which most evolutionists believe, and then there's the young Earth, which many strict theistics believe. So where would you lie in that? Do you believe that there could be a middle ground?
A what?
A middle ground to that?
Yeah, I think there are really strong reasons to believe that the universe is something like 13.7 billion years old. I understand why some people want to have a Earth that's anywhere from 6 to 12,000 years old by the way they read the Bible and add numbers up and things. But I think science is really clear. I don't want to use that word because it sounds like everybody else is more. There's strong evidence that we live in a really, really old universe. And because I think that evidence is so strong, and because I don't think we need to read the Bible as giving us a literal scientific account of creation, I can easily combine the best of what I think we have in science and the best I think what we have in theology and biblical scholarship. A few years ago, I'm a member of the Church of the Nazarene and have taught at Church of the Nazarene academic institutions for a long time. I decided I would do like a poll. I would send around a list of 10 questions to all the Bible scholars, theologians, and philosophers teaching in Church of the Nazarene institutions in the U.S. and Europe, and I think I got one outside of, anyway. And also all the scientists in those institutions. And I'd ask them these questions, and one of them was the age of the Earth. 95% of the theologians thought the Earth was 13.7 billion years old, and 95% of the scientists thought the Earth was 13.7 billion years old. Now, the theologians didn't go to the Bible to find that number, right? But what it says that the theologians are saying to the scientists, we take you seriously. We're going to go with that. We don't think the Bible requires us to believe in a young Earth, and so we can accept what scientists says. And so I think that's it's helpful to remember that some of our very best theologians and biblical scholars don't think that we have to believe the earth is young because of the way they read the Bible. Great. Right here, yes.
There seems to be conflict between theistic evolutionists and intelligent design advocates. Why is that, and where does intelligent design fit in your perspective?
Yeah. I don't know, did you all hear that question? Yeah. It was basically a question of what about intelligent design compared to the idea that God creates through evolution? Intelligent design, just like theistic evolution, or I like to say evolutionary creationism, comes in a lot of different forms. You can have someone like Michael Behe who believes in an old earth and believes in all kinds of evolutionary mechanisms, but wants to hold out for the possibility that occasionally God steps in to design things in a special kind of way. Some evolutionary creationists are fine with that, but most of them want to get away from this idea that God occasionally steps in to fiddle unilaterally or single-handedly to do something that is a design kind of thing. I'm more on the evolutionary kind of side here, theistic evolution, evolutionary creationism. And strangely enough, I'm on this side more for theological reasons than I am for scientific reasons. I study science a ton, but my discipline, first and foremost, is philosophy and theology. And earlier today, I gave a talk on the problem of evil, and I made a really bold claim that God simply can't control creation because of God's love. Now, the idea that God sometimes steps in to fiddle things to make sure they're designed correctly, and that's a unilateral controlling kind of act, that's acceptable in ID or intelligent design circles. I don't really like that idea, because if God can do that there, then I say, well, why didn't God step in and stop that child abuse? Or why didn't God step in and prevent that murder, etc.? So for me, as I try to have a holistic understanding of the world and how God acts, I think the ID people are right to emphasize the design in the world, but those who go so far as to say God sometimes controls to make sure the design works out, I'm a little leery of that move. Does that help? Cool.
What is the definition of afterlife?
What is the definition of the afterlife? I believe in the afterlife. There's a lot of ways to talk about that. I won't cover all of them. I'll just talk about my own. I think we continue having subjective experiences after our bodies die, and we can enjoy eternal bliss with God. So I believe in heaven. And I think that people who say no to God reap the natural negative consequences to saying no to God, which we in common language call hell. So I believe in an afterlife. I believe in the possibility of abundant life, eternal bliss, all that kind of language.
I'm trying to formulate my question, but
Okay.
it really comes down to a couple of things you said, like the age of the Earth, 12.7, or 3 significant digits of resolution of the age. There's a lot more evidence, I would say, to support the age of the Earth than to support a theory of evolution. Evolution is a theory and still unresolved from a scientific standpoint, I would say, without any thought towards religion whatsoever. So I guess I don't know if it's a question, but I'm trying to formulate the question.
That's cool. You said some good things.
Because, and then with respect to intelligent design, well, you answered that, so
Okay.
I'll let you address that.
Awesome. Yeah, I think evolution is a theory, but that doesn't mean it's false. It's the best theory that's on the table given the evidence we have. Could be wrong. 100 years from now, we might say, oh, there's a better way to think of this. But I think we have to be honest with the best that we have at the present. And that includes not only science, but also theology.
Well, I would argue intelligent design is the best.
Okay, yeah, some people do say ID is the best way to go. You can be an ID person and believe in evolution, though. I already mentioned Michael Behe, probably one of the most famous. So,
Sure, I guess that's a
yeah,
fair statement.
yeah.
But
So in terms of
there's
design,
older creationists also.
definitely, old earth creationist is one of the options on the table. For those of you who don't know that terminology, those are people who really look at the world and say, yep, it's super old, but I'm not sure that we have new species evolving from other species. There must be some kind of jumps along the way. And so they don't like to use the word evolution to talk about those kind of jumps. So that's another option. I'm not as attracted to that, but that's definitely part of the discussion. Yeah.
Hi. Under an evolution model, what biological or supernatural occurrence do you believe transformed us from any animal into a being capable of being made in the image of God and capable of being saved?
Well, let me say something controversial if I haven't already. I don't think humans are the only one who can be saved. So I've got no problem agreeing with John Wesley, who thought his horse could be in heaven and his cows could be in heaven. Now, there is a difference, though, between us and horses, at least most horses and most people. And so we want to talk about those differences as real. Whether or not the writer of Genesis, when he talks about being made in the image of God, had this in mind or not, I've written about this, and afterwards I can give you some things to read on that. But I think that while on the one hand we want to talk about how we are different from other creatures in complex ways, most of the time we don't take seriously our similarities with other creatures. Man, there's some smart creatures on this earth that aren't human. Really smart. There's lots of work being done in chimps, dolphins, and wolves about morality in other creatures. We may not be the only creatures on this planet who have a sense of right and wrong. I got no problem with that. I've been around my dog, and my dog is going to hell. I know that. So maybe part of this, thinking about evolution, is not just recognizing that we're different in animals in some ways, but also realizing we share commonalities with other animals and that God cares for all creation. And I won't be disappointed if there's lots and lots of creatures in heaven when I die. Sure, yeah, yes.
Most of this discussion about evolution and creation is a discussion about how we got here, where we are now. But if evolution, evolutionary creation, or as you describe it, is true, it's ongoing, and there's a future of it. So what is the eschaton in this thought pattern?
Yeah.
Based on your imagination or your understanding of biblical truth?
Yes.
What do we have to look forward to in this thought pattern?
Yeah, now we're getting wildly speculative, but I like wild speculation, so let me go wild. Yeah, I don't have any problem thinking there might be creatures in the future who are more complex and smarter than we are. I don't know that's going to happen. You know, who knows? Given climate change, we might all die off before that happens. I don't know that the future is settled in that respect. I just believe that God loves all creatures, and God is calling all creatures to respond as they know how, given their limitations. And if that means more complex, smarter, bigger, faster, whatever than we are, that's great. I think God likes that. I don't know that that's going to happen. Maybe we're the apex, but maybe we're not. I'm kind of agnostic on that question, but I'm very much committed to the idea that God loves all creation, and this doesn't have to be the apex. There might be something more. A young earth creationist, a theistic evolutionist, and a progressive creationist walked into a bar.
Hi.
Yes.
I was at your talk earlier today during chapel. And
Great.
I had one question. How do you reconcile the idea of an omniscient and omnipotent God with the idea that God needs us to do things in the world that He can't?
Excellent. That's a great question. The first thing I do is ask the question, what do we mean by omniscient and what do we mean by omnipotent? The God I believe in, who needs us in order to have a love relationship, is the most powerful being in the universe. I like to use the biblical language of almighty rather than omnipotent, but if you let me define omnipotent, I can use that one too. I think this God knows everything that's possible for God to know, so God is omniscient. Now, there are other ways that theologians have used those language that I don't really like very much, and it's not compatible with the idea that God needs us. I just think this other way of thinking about things not only fits well with Scripture, but also fits well with my experience and the general thrust of where science is going. Great question.
Who had their hand up over here?
This is another follow-up from this morning's talk. The statement that God is not in control and that God can't intervene sometimes, you know, when horrible things are happening. So then how would you explain examples in the Bible and in life that where God did directly intervene? How does
Yes.
that fit in?
Awesome question. Good. I think those really happen, but God wasn't the only actor in those occurrences. So when the Bible says God does X, I think there was creaturely cooperation, maybe not humans, but other elements involved there. I don't think, let me make a bold statement. I know of no story or statement in the entire Bible that explicitly says God alone brought something about and there was no creaturely contribution. God hardening Pharaoh's heart, that fits into my scheme. Creation of the world, that fits into my scheme. Now there's tons and tons of passages that talk about God acting, but don't say anything about creation. And I'm speculating that the creation was involved there. I like to, Sunday morning I used this as an illustration. And let me preface this by saying I have a major character flaw in my life. I am a fan of the New England Patriots. Pray for me, pray for me. Sinners in the hand of a loving God. Now, a few years ago when I lost my voice and when the Patriots came from behind to beat the Falcons and I was cheering so loudly I just couldn't talk anymore, I woke up the next morning and there on the newspaper headline says, Tom Brady wins another Super Bowl. Now that's right because he did win the Super Bowl. But if you read that line and thought to yourself, well, Tom Brady must have been the only person playing that day, you're like, you don't know football if you think Tom Brady was the only New England Patriot. Now it could be that New England would have never come back had they not had the greatest of all time at quarterback. So it may be that Tom Brady is a necessary cause in the fulfillment of the Super Bowl drive to win it all. What if we use that language in thinking with God? What if whenever in the Bible it says God does something, we don't have to automatically think, well, God must have sovereignly controlled everyone and been the only actor in the situation. What if we can say, well, there were creaturely elements or actors that also cooperated? Now, I admit this is me speculating. It doesn't actually say that. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it talks about our cooperation. But I speculate in that way, driven by what you earlier said of a God who shouldn't be blamed for the evil in the world, who can't single-handedly control it. So it's my concern to understand the Bible, reality, and suffering that drive me to speculate that maybe this way of thinking about God that can be supported by Scripture but means that we have to rethink our view of God makes a lot more sense, at least to me. Thanks.
I'm right next to Laura.
Oh, yeah.
Hey. So I'm interested in, I thought I understood from something you said earlier, that you do not ascribe to the idea that God created from nothing.
I don't think I said that earlier, but that's true.
Okay. Well then, I don't know. So I'm curious. It's in not some of the more popular creeds, perhaps, but some of the ancient creeds of Christendom actually have that God created from nothing.
I challenge you to find one.
Okay.
I don't think it's in
I can't
any
remember.
of them. I don't even think it's in the Westminster Confession, but I could be wrong about that.
Anyway.
Anyway.
So.
What do I do with that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I am going to not dive into a long explanation of that because I'm in the midst of writing a book, and once you write the book, you say everything that needs to be said, right? I'm joking. The Bible doesn't explicitly say God creates from nothing. I think this is an idea that emerged in Christian history for good reasons, and I think we there are reasons why we might think that God creates in a different kind of way. And I'm going to propose that in this book, so I'm going to wait to give you my answer. Sorry. You have to go buy the book. Yeah. Actually, if you send me a private email, I'll send you a long document. How's that? Yes.
I guess I have the mic. So.
Okay.
So probably everybody in this room is going to be having, hopefully, conversations about science and faith and talking to people. And one advice I'd really give people is to get your terms straight. I mean, especially the more supercharged the word is, the more that's true. So might as well go to the E word,
Yeah.
right? So in any discussion, you really need to start by knowing where the person's coming from.
Yeah.
And I would really encourage people to ask, let's use evolution, what does evolution mean to you? What do you mean when you use that word, or what is your understanding?
A lot of people use that word
because
and they think
it's
there's
all
no
over the
God.
map. I mean, the
Yeah.
simplest that things change over time.
Yeah.
Right? It's pretty hard to argue against that one.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And the but mechanisms behind, and the other thing is we tend to box ourselves or let others box us into false dichotomies, and the world's full of them. And deep down, we know this is a much more nuanced world, so I would encourage people to define your terms. Most importantly, get the terms from who you're talking to, and don't get boxed into false dichotomies.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
So we're having a great conversation. I think that we're going to have one more question, but I want to be, before we closed, and we have one more question here. Let me just say that tomorrow morning, there are 2 opportunities to continue the discussion if you really would like to. The first one is I'm teaching a philosophy of religion class with some students, and I've decided to, and we're actually reading Dr. Oord's book, The Uncontrolling Love of God. And so tomorrow morning, we're going to be discussing with Dr. Oord that book. And I am very happy to open up that conversation for anybody who wants to come and join. So that is in Hastings, which is another building on campus. You can find a campus map, and it's room 125. And if you want to come and join that conversation, you're welcome to come and ask. We'll have more time for questions tomorrow morning. And then the other opportunity tomorrow, sorry?
Time.
That's 9:25 until 10:40. 9:25 until 10:40 tomorrow morning. And then as well, at 12:15, Dr. Oord's going to be joining another class. There's not as much room in the second class, but it's in CLC. It's in the Cultural Life Center, room 219. Dr. Oord's going to be joining another class, and we're going to be having a good theological discussion there as well. So if you did want to continue the discussion and you were available on campus tomorrow, you'd be welcome to join us in either of those locations. So we have, I have a couple of questions. I've one question here, and we'll wrap up the night.
As I answer this question, I'd like to have one final statement. That'd be great. Yeah. Great, cool. Yeah. Gene.
We've been talking about some pretty heavy issues,
yes.
Evolution, et cetera, et cetera. But what about the Christian today is faced with questions more immediate, which are, I feel, just as important today? Abortion, same-sex marriages, and questions such as these, where what we're doing or what we may do with these questions that are much more immediate and more profound and has an effect on today.
Yeah.
What does the Christian do with these more immediate questions?
Yes, that's a great question. I actually think those kinds of issues fall under the general realm of science and religion dialogue. You mentioned evolution as being one of them, and that there's more than just evolution. I totally agree with you. And I think we ought to take the posture of openness, honesty, fidelity of the Christian faith as we wrestle with these difficult things. There are Christians in this room who have different views on same-sex marriage. I can guarantee it. I don't know you all, because I've been around enough Christians to talk about this. So that, just like evolution and other topics, we need to listen to each other carefully and charitably and engage those with courage. That fits very nicely into how I want to close this evening. Thanks for asking that. I have stuck my head way out tonight. I've said some things that made some of you uncomfortable. I've been very vulnerable. I've tried to open up my heart and let you know what I think, and said at the very beginning, I haven't got things all figured out, but this makes the most sense to me. I want to close with what matters to me most. Number one in my life, in fact, just about every day I wake up and think about this. The number one thing in my life is I want to live a life of love. That's my primary motivation. That means loving others, myself, God. It means loving with my mind, heart, soul, and strength. Love is what is at the very core of my motivations. That doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything I say, even if you also believe in love. But I just want you to know that's where I'm coming from. I, above all things in my life, want to be a person of love like Jesus Christ. Thanks so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate the conversation.